So up until now, in these many lessons we've had, we've talked a bit about built-in functions inside PHP, which are functions that exist inside the PHP language that we can use in order to do many different operations inside our code. And there are so many functions out there that we can't do one episode and talk about all of them, since it's going to be a very long episode if we had to do that. And honestly, I don't know all the functions because there's so many of them. But what we can do is we can talk about some of the more popular ones that you might want to use at some point inside your code for various things. So in this episode, we're going to talk about some of the functions that are built into PHP that we can use for different things. So inside my document here, I'm going to scroll down so we have our little PHP section. And the first functions I want to talk about are some that are related when it comes to using strings inside your PHP code. So let's go ahead and create a string here so we can actually do something with it. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm just going to call it string so we have some kind of name for it. And then I'm going to say hello world. It is important to mention here that whenever we create a function or reference to a function inside our code, we do so by referring to the name of the function followed by a pair of parentheses, because the parentheses are going to be used to call upon that function so we can do something with it. So what I can do here is I can say we want to echo something out, and I can call upon a function called string length, which is written by saying strlen. And that stands for string length. And what we can use this for is to call upon a function in order to tell us how long a certain string is. So if we were to actually save this by pasting in the string inside the parentheses, refresh the browser, you can see we get 12. And the reason we get 12 is of course because we have 12 different letters or empty spaces inside our string. So if we also count the empty space in there, we do have 12 different characters. We do also have a function that can go in and actually tell us the position of a certain string inside this string here. So what I can do is I can say something like string position. And string position is going to require two different things. First, we want to have the actual string that we want to get the position from. So in this case here, our variable string. Then I want to say comma, which is a separator to add a second parameter inside this function here. And then I can tell it what I want to see the position of inside this string. So in this case, I could say, okay, so what is the position of O inside this function here? So in this case, I can go down and say I want to get O, save it, go inside, refresh, and then we can see we get 4. And the reason we get 4 is because we always start at 0 when we count inside programming. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is going to be the O. So now we got the position of O inside this string. And it's not just when it comes to a single letter, we can actually check for more than just one letter. So I can go in here and say, I want to check for WO. So in this case, that would be this location right here. So I can refresh and then we can see we get 6. Now we do also have a function to replace a string inside another string. So what I can do is I can say something like str_replace. And by doing so, I can also go in and say, what do I want to replace inside this string here? So I'm just going to delete everything we have except for string. So the first parameter is going to be, what do we want to replace? So in this case, it is going to be world. And I want to replace it with something else. And in this case, we can just say Daniel. So we say, hello, Daniel, inside this sentence. So if we were to save this, go back inside the browser, you can see we get hello, Daniel, because I replace world with Daniel. Then we can also go in and use another function in order to convert all the different letters to lowercase. So if we were to go in and say I want to string to lower, then I can save it, go inside, refresh, and then we can see everything is lowercase. So no longer have these uppercase letters inside this sentence. Everything has been converted to lowercase. And the same thing, we can do it the other way. So we can say string to upper, which would of course do the opposite. So if we were to go in, you can see everything is uppercase. And if I want to be a little bit more complex here, what we can also do is we can do something called substring, which is something that I do occasionally use. So if we were to go in here, so I can say we have a substring by saying substr. And what I can do in here is I can go in and say that I want to grab a certain part of this string here. So the first parameter is going to be the actual string. So in this case, this is going to be hello world. Then I'm going to say comma, and then I want to say, where do I want the offset to be? So where do we want to start from? And in this case here, I could say we want to start from the index of 2. So if we were to go inside my string and count, this is going to be 0, 1, 2, which means that we start here. And then I want to have a length set to 2. So from here and then 2 forward, which means that if I were to save this, you can see that we get LL. And we can actually do something quite smart here, because if you want to do something in a very long string and you want to start from a couple of letters into the string, but also end it a couple of letters at the end of the string, instead of having this long string and then saying, okay, so, 22 characters later, I want you to like stop grabbing the string. Instead, what I can do is I can say -2, which means that it's not going to start counting the index from the start, but from the beginning. So in this case here, it is 0, 1, 2, which means we start at L. And then -2 is going to be 0, 1, 2, which is the other L over here. So as you can see, we get low whirl, because right now that is what we're grabbing. And with this, we do also have another one called explode, which sounds very dramatic. But essentially what this one does, since we now have already talked about arrays in the last episode, this is one we can actually talk about. It takes a string and it says, okay, so where do you want to take apart this string? And then all the different parts you take apart are going to be placed inside an array, because we might have multiple pieces of parts when we explode this string. What I want to do is first of all remove the parameters inside of here except for the string, and I want to go in and say that the first parameter, because this has to be the first one, is going to be what do I want to be the divider whenever I explode the string. So let's say I want to take any sort of spaces inside a string and divide the entire string depending on the spaces. What I can do is I can say we have a string, and that is just going to be a space, which means that now it is going to take all the spaces inside the string and cut it like a scissor, which means that now we have hello and world, two separate strings, and it's going to place these inside an array. Now in this case here, of course, we can't echo it because that would actually create an error. We can actually check this out because this is actually going to be an array. So instead what we can do is use another built-in method called printr, which is going to be printing out, I believe it stands for print readable, if I remember correctly. So essentially it's going to print out data in a readable format, so we can actually read it, which in this case, because of an array, we might want to read what is inside the array. So what I can do is I can just include it inside my printr and refresh it, and then we can see we get hello world. So if I were to go in here and just say that we have more than one space, so I can just separate the word a couple of times, you can see that we get an even longer array because we have more divisions or explosions inside this array here. So now, having talked a bit about string functions, we do also have some related to math inside our PHP code, because in a lot of cases we might want to do math at some point. So having some math functions is something that is really useful. So let's go and delete our function down here, and also change our string, because right now we don't need to have a string, but we do need to have some numbers so we can actually perform math inside this little example here. So what I'll do is I'll create a variable and call it number. And then I'll go in, and instead of a string, I want to say something like -5.5, just so we have an example to use. The first one I want to show you is a function called abs, which stands for absolute, I believe. You can actually go in here and check it out, because there is a really smart function inside our editor where we go in and hover our cursor on top of a function, and then it gives us a little description here. And as you can see, it says absolute value. So we can get the absolute value of a certain number. So if I were to go in here and paste it in, so in this case, when we have -5.5, it is going to get the absolute value, which basically means that it's going to get the value no matter if it's minus or positive. It's just going to get the actual value. So if I were to save this, go inside, you can see we get 5.5. Especially inside my game dev courses on the channel, we use abs a lot to get, the absolute value instead of having to deal with negatives and positives and stuff like that. So it's just a really neat function to have. We can also round this up, so we can use a function called round. And this is basically going to do what you think it's going to do. It is going to round this up to the nearest whole number. So when I refresh it, you can see we get -6. Then we also have something called POW, which is going to be the power of or exponential expression. So in this case here, we can't really use number because that is not really how this works. But what I can do is I can feed it to numbers. So I can say 2, 3. So again, this would be exponential expressions, which means that we have to say 2 times 2, which is 4, and then 4 times 2, which is 8 in this case here. So if we were to save this, refresh it, you can see we get 8. Then we can also do the square root of something. So we can say SQRT, which means that we're going to get the square root of one certain number. So let's say 2 in this case here, and then you can see we get 1.4. It might have been a little bit easier if we did something like 16. just to like show this in a little bit more normal way. So 16, the square root of that is going to be 4. But now another one that I have as a favorite is one called random. So we can actually go and say RAND, which is going to give us a random number between two numbers. So I can go in here and say I want a random number between 1 and 100. And in this case here, we're going to go in. When I refresh it, oh, okay, so in this case, it's going to be 51. If I refresh again, oh, it's going to be 49. Now it's going to be 3. Now it's going to be 6. Now it's going to be 10. So it's just going to keep feeding us a random number each time I refresh the browser. I've seen people use this one, especially when it comes to reloading images inside their website as they're developing a website, because your browser do have something called a cache that is going to store certain data, so it's easier and faster to load your website the next time you refresh it. So when you're sitting there developing and constantly maybe swapping out a certain image and it's not really changing when you refresh the browser because, oh, it stored the cache of your last image, so it's not showing the new version, then you can use this one and put behind the image name in order to get a new image. But again, that's more of a developer trick you can use, but it's not really something you should use for releasing a website, since there's a reason why a browser stores a cache of your images. That's because it's easier to load next time, right? So now this was a couple of different math functions we could use, but what about arrays? Because we learned about arrays in the previous episode. We do have quite a few different array functions. I did cover some of them in the last episode, but we do also have many others I could show you. So let's just go ahead and create an array called array, and inside of here we can fill it in with fruits, just like we did in the last episode. So we can say apple, we can also say we have something like banana, and we do also have orange. And then we can just manipulate this array using many different functions. The first one is going to be one called count, which is actually one that we use quite often when we pull data from a database. I do think I showed that one in the previous episode, but let's just go ahead and talk about it here. So if I were to say echo and say I want to echo out a count function that has the array inside of it, we can actually see how many pieces of data are inside this array here. So if we were to do that, you can see we get 3 because we have 3 pieces of data. So let's say we have an example where I pulled data from a database and I need to check, did we actually get anything from the database? Because if I didn't, then there's no need to run a bunch of PHP code because we didn't get anything from the database. So this is going to be a very useful one that you will get to do a little bit of when we actually start talking about databases inside my episodes here. So this one is worth remembering. But now we do also have one here where we can go in and say, is something an actual array? So we can say is array, so is underscore array. And this one is going to give us a true or false statement. So in this case, it's going to be false or it's going to be true. And like we talked about when it came to our data type episode, a 0 means false and a 1 means true. So in this case, it did actually return as true because this is in fact an array. And we did also talk about a few other ones in the last episode that we can just briefly just mention in this one. So if I were to go in here and say we have something called array underscore push, we can now push in data inside our array at the end of the array. So I can go in and say we have this array here, and I want to add a piece of data, which is going to be a kiwi, just to add something else to it. So if I were to actually print R this one, because in this case, we do actually need to print R in order to see all the data. And of course, I want to have this after we array push. So I'm just going to move it down to the next line here. Save it, go inside, and then you can see we get kiwi inside our array at the end there. But now one we didn't talk about in the last episode is how to remove data from inside the array. So what I can also do is I can go below here and say that I want to do something called array pop. So array pop, and inside this one we just need to have one parameter since we're only removing the last array index. So if we were to save this one and actually echo it out or print R it out inside the browser, then you can see we get the same array, but now kiwi has actually been removed at the end here, so we no longer have it again. And we can also go in and use another function where we actually reverse the entire array. So if we were to go in here and say we have this array here, but this time I want to array underscore reverse the array, so parentheses, and then I'm going to insert the array inside the parentheses here. Then you can see we get everything, but it's reversed. So we get orange first, banana, and then apple. And now in the last episode, we did talk about something called array underscore splice, which means that we're splicing two arrays together and merging them into each other. But we also do have something called array underscore merge. But merge is a little bit different because it's going to take the data and put it at the end of the first array, whereas splice is going to allow for you to put it anywhere in between any of the existing data inside the first array. So if we were to go in here, we can also do array underscore merge. So we're going to say merge, and then I want to have another array up here. So I can just copy paste this down, call this one array 1, this one array 2. And let's go ahead and change some of the data inside of the second array. So again, we could just use kiwi and say we want to merge these two together. So if we were to do this, I can say that I want to have the first array, which is array 1, and the second array, which is going to be array 2. And when we do this, I can go back in, print it out inside the browser, and then you can see we get kiwi, which has been placed at the end of the other array. So all the data inside the second array here is just going to get added to the first array up there because we merged them together at the end of the first array. So just a few more array functions you could know about after we talked about in the last episode. But we do also have something else, because inside PHP, in some cases, we do also deal with dates and time. And when it comes to these, we do need to know how to get the date and time because, for example, again, if we talk about databases, in a lot of cases, you might want to know exactly what the time is when you upload certain data to a database. So you might want to have a DateTime format that you need to use in order to get the date time. So let's go ahead and start by echoing out a certain date. So what I can say is we have a date function. And inside this date function, I want to tell it the format that I want to echo out the date. And I will include a link in the description for all these different formats if you want to see them. But essentially, if you want to get the full year, you can go inside and use a capitalized Y. Then you can separate it with a dash. And then we want to get the month, the day. And then we can also get the time, which is going to be the hours, colon. Then we want to get the minutes and also the seconds. So in this case, if we were to go inside the browser, you can see we get the full date with the year, month, day, and the current time inside our little date function here. But now we do also have something else we can use. So if we were to go down here and say I want to echo out the time, so we're going to say time parentheses, then you can see we're going to get this weird long number inside the browser here. So you can see we get this random string, and you might be thinking, so what does that do? Well, let's try and refresh the browser again and see what happens. Oh, it updated. Okay, so if I click this every second, you can see it's updating by one number every second that I click, because this is the seconds since a certain date in history. I can't remember the exact date, but what we can do is we can go in and hover our mouse cursor on top of the function. Oh, and it actually provides a link to the php.net website. So I'm going to open this one. And then you can see we get this little link here which explains that it is since January 1st, 1970 that we do get the amount of seconds since then. And the reason this is something we can use is because we might want to get a certain time difference between now and now. So we can actually subtract these two different numbers and get the amount of seconds. And this, by the way, is called a Unix timestamp, which we can also use for the next function where we actually go in and we want to know what is the Unix timestamp for a certain date at some point. So what I can do is I can actually create a string. So we can just go ahead and call this one variable date, and then I can set it equal to a random date at some point. Again, using the same format that we talked about before, which was the DateTime format. So I can go in, paste in a random date from my notes here, and then I can go in and say that I want to get the string to time, str2 time, and then I can paste in the date and see what is the Unix timestamp for this particular date here. And in this case, it's not going to update every single time I click it because we're getting a fixed date or fixed time of seconds from 1970, the 1st of January, until this particular date that I pasted in here, which is 2023, the 11th of April, which is today. And we have many other different types of date functions you could use inside your PHP code, and the same thing goes for the strings and math. And we also have something when it comes to like files inside your PHP or files inside your website. You can delete files or do something else to it using functions. And I will leave a link to many different functions you could be using that you might want to check out. And I will have that inside the description of this video here. So if you want to check out something on your own, then you're more than welcome to do so. But for now, these are some of the different functions you can use in order to change things inside your PHP code. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this little episode on built-in functions. In the next one, we're going to talk a bit about user-defined functions, which is a lot more fun because now we actually get to create our own functions, which means that we can start creating a function called something specific, followed by a pair of parentheses, and then we can decide, do we want to add parameters to this function to change how the functions work and stuff like that. And functions is something that we use a lot inside our code, pretty much constantly. Anytime you create anything using PHP, it's going to have functions inside of it. So functions, it's important, and that's what we're going to learn in the next episode. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you guys next time.